The other day, as I was driving down the interstate, there was a bus that passed me in the passing lane. And, you know, it's one of those cases where you catch this coming out of the corner of your eye, and you don't really notice it at first because, you know, it's a bus, but then all of a sudden there's something about this bus that's different. And then it does catch your eye. And it's not just the normal bus that you would expect. It's not that bus that is the yellow school bus that has the kids riding in it that are either going to school or from school. No, this is a different bus. This bus is white, and this bus has bars on the windows. And so immediately you come to know that this bus is not like any ordinary bus. This bus is transporting prisoners. It is a bus that is owned by the state of Missouri, that is used to transport prisoners probably from one facility to another, I'm not really sure. But this bus that I noticed passing me was a bus filled with young men. A bus filled with young men that were in orange jumpsuits. And the other thing that I really noticed about this bus was that it was full. There really wasn't a whole lot of empty spaces in this bus. It wasn't a little bus, it's a pretty good sized bus. And it would have been just for me another trip down the interstate with a bus passing me by, except for the fact that it wasn't an ordinary bus. It wasn't yellow, it was white. And it would have been an ordinary trip also if it wasn't for the fact that as this bus was passing me by, and as I was looking at the bus, I happened to catch a look at one of the prisoners who was looking back at me. And it's one of those instances, I know you've had this happen to you, where you are looking at someone and all of a sudden they look at you and you catch each other's eyes. And you know that they know that you're looking at them. As our eyes met and as we were looking at each other, I will never forget that moment. Because as our eyes connected, there was something about that young man's eyes at that very instant that I noticed that left an impression on me. That young man's eyes were empty. They were lost. They were almost desperate. And there was this feeling of emptiness, if you will, inside of me that left me wondering what had happened. What had happened? What was it that brought him to that moment to be on that bus, heading to a place where I knew that I would not want to be going? He had been on this bus, and I don't know if he had been heading down this road for a long time and didn't realize it, and all of a sudden caught up to him, or what his situation was. I want to mention to you one more situation. I was also driving, I drive down the interstate a lot. I was driving down the interstate again, and as I was coming down the interstate, I happened to notice in the median, there's a little grove of trees there in between Oak Grove and Bay City, right in the median. Many of you know where that's at. And in that grove of trees right there, in the median of both sides of the highway, I happened to notice out of the corner of my eye again, and I looked over to make sure I was seeing what I thought I saw. There was a man who had a bunch of plastic bags that he had laid out on the ground. And everything that he had was right there next to him. That was where he had been camping out. That's where he was staying for the day. And I thought to myself again, what was it? What was it that had happened to this man? What was it that brought him to this place? And I wondered, had there been opportunities maybe that had taken him down a different path that might have taken him to a different place that he somehow missed? Did anyone ever maybe offer something better that went unnoticed to either one of them? Or maybe they just chose not to respond. Maybe they chose to respond to a different voice that took them down a different path. You see, there are many voices that come to us today with all different sorts of advice. All different sorts of words that offer to us many different choices in our lives. And some of those voices don't really require much of us. And then there are others that come to us with a requirement for a deep commitment. And this is where we hear the voice of Micah coming to us this morning. Micah, the Old Testament prophet, was one of many voices that were speaking out in his day. There were other voices, just as there are other voices like there are today, that spoke words maybe that did not require much. But unlike those voices, the voice of Micah spoke words that were maybe a little bit less appealing because, you see, they were words that had requirements. They were words that had depth to them. Micah saw the condition of God's people. And Micah made a choice. He made a choice to reach out to those people, to speak out, because he didn't want to one day look into someone's eyes and see someone who was lost. To see someone who was desperate. Someone who was empty. The prophet Micah had been outspoken. He'd been outspoken, to say the very least, and he had spoken out on injustices and on the sins of God's people. The sins and the injustices that had left God wondering, what in the world happened here? Micah describes how the people are just somehow going through the motions and are living a faith they somehow proclaim on Sundays, but doesn't go with them the rest of the week. They come on Sabbath and they worship, but somehow the rest of the week, that faith is not there with them. The worship of God has become empty of any value. And that depth is only something that is self-satisfying to them. And so now the stage is set for the 6th chapter of Micah. And in those first verses of that 6th chapter, we find God bringing his case into court to express the significance of these charges and how deep and how important these charges are. God calls upon what? God calls upon the mountains. God calls upon the hills and even the very foundations of the earth to be the witness and to be the jury. God knows that the mountains and the hills and the foundations of the earth realize the depth of this situation that God's people are now in, because you see, the mountains, the hills, the very foundations of the earth have been a part of everything up until this moment. They are a part of that original covenant. You see, it was upon a mountain that God wrote the commandments. The commandments that he wrote at Sinai, taking those tablets out of the side of the mountain and making that covenant with his people. And if you remember, when Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees calling upon him to rebuke his disciples, Jesus said, I tell you that if these disciples become silent, even the stones will cry out.